What's up, I'm Troubleshoot. In this quick video, I'll be showing you how to optimize Manor Lords for the best possible performance. Just keep in mind that this game is still in development, and of course, things are going to change over the next few weeks to months, etc. But for the most part, the main points that I make in this video should probably still stand for a long time to come when it comes to getting much better performance out of Manor Lords. So let's go ahead and continue. For this quick video, I'll be hopping into a brand new game. The first time you load in, you'll be about here. I'll go ahead and pause the game, head across to settings, followed by VSync, and I'll make sure that this is turned off. Then we'll also make sure that the max frame rate is set to unlimited, and with everything left at ultra quality, we're at 85 FPS. Zooming out, we now get 125 FPS as less detailed textures and models are loaded in until we zoom really far in where this game is put through its paces and things get really detailed. We drop to around 50-ish FPS. Just keep in mind, I am currently using FSR, which is the default for the game. If we go ahead and turn off Anti-Aliasing completely, which includes upscaling, make sure it's 100%, and return to the game, you'll see we're now sitting at 56. So nothing much has changed. The medium distance, we're back up to 80, all the way out, we're at 140. Before we get too deep into the weeds in this optimization guide, I'd just like to say that if you're going to be playing this game, you are going to get a much better experience if you're playing with an NVIDIA graphics card, as settings, graphics, anti-aliasing, setting to FSR for upscaling doesn't really get us any extra performance. If we set it to DLSS, quality, which is the same setting that we had for FSR, which is unfortunately only NVIDIA graphics card specific, we're setting at 90-ish at about the mid distance here. Zooming in, we're now at a solid 60, and zooming all the way out to just before the map, we're now at 150. So there's a big boost in performance here when it comes to using DLSS over FSR, but besides that, the rest of the steps in this video should work for pretty much all different hardware setups, as this game is mostly GPU heavy and GPU limited rather than CPU limited, at least until you have massive areas built out. Let's quickly run through the in-game options, showing you exactly what the difference is between them and the kind of performance impact you can expect. This will be a quick run through though. Settings, graphics, starting at the very top, display mode should be set to full screen for the best performance, but on most systems, borderless full screen is going to be just fine, especially so if you're going to be tabbing in and out of the game often to access browsers and things like that. It's usually just a better experience. Resolution should match your display, and if you're playing at borderless full screen mode, this is not something that you can adjust anyways. It's locked to your screen resolution, which is perfect. Anti-aliasing, as we've already lightly touched on, will have a big impact on your performance, especially if you're choosing to use an upscaler like FSR, DLSS, or XESS. TAA and FXAA are specifically just for anti-aliasing, and there's no upscaling going on or anything like that for added performance. If you want to test your raw hardware performance, set this to off so you're not using any kind of artificial upscaling. Otherwise, you can choose DLSS or FSR for slightly bigger frame numbers, so the difference between different options is a bit more apparent. Anyways, we'll be returning here in just a bit. For now, we'll skip over it though. I'll be leaving it on DLSS quality, which should have the least upscaling impact, artifacts, blur, etc. VSync should definitely be turned off unless you're getting screen tearing where the top and the bottom half of your screen don't match up. Max frame rate should be set to unlimited if you're benchmarking. Otherwise, if you're playing on a laptop, a Steam Deck, etc., then setting it to 60 or 30 FPS lock is going to help you save a bit of battery power as you're not rendering so many frames. For most people though, unlimited is perfect. Then sharpening, unless you're using some kind of crazy upscaling like FSR on performance, DLSS on performance, etc., where the game is rendered in a tiny window and blown up to be the normal size of your monitor, then it should be fine to leave this off. Otherwise, you can adjust it to your taste here. The performance impact should be pretty much negligible. For the rest of the options here, I'll quickly click in between these in places that I would think best describes what's happening and give you my opinion of what you should probably be choosing when it comes to getting better performance versus better looks, gameplay experience, etc. So to start with, shader quality. If we zoom all the way in, we'll test it about here. This is Ultra, and we're sitting at a solid 60 FPS. High takes us to 64, medium 62, and finally low 65. For the frame difference between these options, I'd recommend you either choose low for low-end systems or preferably Ultra where applicable. There's a very subtle difference between each individual image, and this probably isn't the best place to be showing you exactly what's going on, but it's what I've got in this default little test area. And for the most part, I'd recommend you choose Ultra for the best visual quality, as the in-between options don't really make sense here. It's either one extreme or the other. Then shadow quality, starting at Ultra, High, so we're at 70, Medium, still 70, and finally Low, which takes us up to 80 FPS, but you can see practically all of the shadows are gone. There's pretty much nothing left. Each step here adds progressively more and more shadows, all the way up until about High. Then the Ultra setting seems to add extra resolution to the shadows, and it doesn't really actually add more of them. So the only option that really makes sense here is either Medium, so we have at least some shadows, or preferably High, where we have the most amount of shadows, giving everything a realistic place in the world without taking too much extra performance away for practically nothing. So this is High, and we're back to 71-ish FPS. Then post-processing quality, again this is going to be very subtle between the different options, but I'll quickly run through them here. First of all, we've got Ultra, then High, practically no performance difference, Medium, where we jump up to 73 FPS, and finally Off, we're at 75-ish FPS, although you can start to see that things just don't look anywhere near as good as they used to. For this, I'd recommend having this always on, so having Medium as the absolute lowest choice here, and everything above it doesn't really add all that much. It's probably a good place to leave it. Then Bounced Light Approximation. This is Ultra, we're at 72 FPS, High, still the same, Medium, 73 FPS, and finally Off, still 72, 73. There's practically no difference between these, both visually and performance-wise, and for this reason, I think this option is probably currently broken. The game is still in development. I'd recommend you leave it on, as in the future this will probably be changed to add something, and there's no performance impact of having it on anyways. Probably leave it on Medium, if not High. Then Volumetric Clouds. Tilt the camera to look upwards towards the sky. There's not really many clouds here, except for this one. If we were to turn Volumetric Clouds off, you'll see the cloud is now vanished, and we can bring it back with setting it back to on. As for performance, we're at 92-ish, and off, we're at 94-ish. If we instead look at the ground and zoom out a little bit, does this affect our performance out here? Well, we're at 106. If we turn the clouds back on, we're at 106, 107. There's practically no performance difference here, unless you find you're zooming really close into what's going on and tilt the camera to look pretty much towards the sky. You're not really going to notice too much of a performance impact here, and for that reason I'd probably recommend leaving this on, as there's just a super small impact. When it comes to gameplay, you'd probably want the scene to look quite a bit better when you zoom all the way in, unless you're trying to really nitpick and push for FPS, in which case leave it off. I'll definitely be leaving this option on. Then terrain texture resolution. This completely has to do with VRAM, and lowering the option here does of course load in lower quality textures. So here's low, and this is ultra. The ground looks noticeably different, but as you'll have noticed, I'm at 74, dropping it to low, I'm still at 74. There's no difference here, and that's pretty much the same for all graphics cards of all manufacturers. Terrain resolution has only an effect on VRAM, and in this game the effect is practically unnoticeable. When it comes to VRAM usage, the game's always going to use as much VRAM as it can, up to about 7 or 8 gigs, and for that reason I'd recommend leaving this set to ultra, unless for some reason you're really trying to save on VRAM, such as you have a 4 gig graphics card, in which case you may need to lower this, but most of the time Ultra is going to work just fine across any graphics card. Then view distance. We can adjust a master switch here, and we can individually control grass density, distance, and foliage. These all have to do with view distance, and as you're flying through the world, looking at things from a distance, you'll notice that there's certain objects and things like that that pop in, render and de-render at different distances. I'd recommend that for the master switch. Simply just view distance. You always leave this on ultra, otherwise pop-in is super noticeable. As you saw, I was zooming in and out at a very reasonable distance, and things were appearing and disappearing at a really weird rate. If we're flying through the world and traveling around, it's going to be even more noticeable, and for that reason, Ultra is definitely what you'll want to have selected here. We're at 105-ish FPS, and dropping this to low, for example, more objects are not loaded in, and we do technically move up to 120 FPS, but moving throughout the world and looking around the place is just not going to be anywhere near the same, and for this reason, if you can afford it, I definitely recommend leaving view distance on Ultra. Now we can more granularly control it with grass density, distance, and foliage quality. In most scenes, you're not really going to be noticing too much grass until you zoom into a certain point where most of it seems to render, so maybe about here-ish. And you can control the density of this main grass over here by playing around with grass density, of course. This is what it looks like on low. If we set it to medium, you'll see more grass is rendered in. I need to tilt and pan the camera for grass to load in, but anyways, medium. This is high, and finally this is ultra. You can see the higher that this option is set, the more grass is loaded in. Obviously, we're adjusting grass density. When it comes to performance, there is a relatively big impact of having more grass loaded in, but for the most part, I'd recommend you leave this on high for the best visual quality without losing too much. Otherwise, if you set it all the way down, the game just looks a little bit flat and barren. So high is where I'll be leaving this. Then grass distance is the distance at which grass obviously loads in. If we were to move the camera around, you'll see that this is low, and if we fly around, grass pops in weird patches as such. I would definitely recommend having this on a much higher option if possible, otherwise things just look a little bit weird. So for example, moving up to medium, it pushes it back a little bit, but it's still definitely noticeable to say the least. High is much more reasonable, and this is a good place to leave it for laptops and pocket devices. Otherwise, if you're running a full-blown gaming desktop, I definitely recommend leaving it on ultra for the best, most immersive gameplay. Then finally, foliage quality. If we drop this down to low, you'll see that it doesn't really affect anything except for trees. If we were to zoom out a little bit, you'll see that trees turn into lower quality models much sooner rather than later, and there's a huge amount of pop-in when we have this set all the way down to low. We're at 140 FPS, and if we raise it to medium, it's much less noticeable, except you can see it's about this distance over here, where the trees start to drop down to lower quality LODs. This does drop our performance down to 120-ish from 140, so there's a huge impact when it comes to this particular setting. If we move it up to high, this is much more reasonable. Trees aren't popping in and out as we move the camera around, and if we move plus minus back to where we were, we're still at 114-ish FPS. Then finally, all the way back up to ultra. Once again, there's practically no pop-in for the most part, and if we move our camera back, we're still at 110-ish FPS. So, for this reason, I'd recommend choosing high at probably the least when it comes to consistent gameplay performance moving around. Besides that, there's only one option left that'll help us get much better performance. As I already demonstrated way back in the beginning, anti-aliasing, specifically upscaling, being FSR, DLSS, and XESS, have a huge performance boost. So if we set it back to off with our optimized settings, you'll see that I'm currently getting about 80 FPS. There's quite a bit of shimmering in the trees over here, for example, and this is caused by aliasing. If we used anti-aliasing like FXAA, you'll see that the shimmering is a little bit blurrier, but it's definitely still noticeable, and we're still at 80-ish FPS. If we move instead to TAA, it's a little bit blurrier still, but it definitely looks streets ahead of FXAA, and of course native. If you're going to be playing at a native resolution, I'd recommend using TAA anti-aliasing for the best visual quality. However, most people are going to be stuck using FSR, DLSS, or XESS, depending on what kind of graphics card they have. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, I'd definitely recommend using DLSS on quality for the best visual look and of course performance. I've moved up to 105-ish FPS. If instead you don't have an NVIDIA graphics card, you can choose FSR on anything, including NVIDIA graphics cards. AMD have made FSR super open and it runs on practically anything. It looks a little bit less sharp than DLSS, but performance is slightly boosted to about 92-ish FPS in this current scene. XESS I don't think works on my current system, but having it selected, things are pretty blurry and we're running at 93-ish FPS. And of course, pushing it back to FSR quality, we're at 93-ish. So compared to native performance, we're only really gaining about 5 to 10 FPS using FSR or XESS, but if you have DLSS available, as you have an NVIDIA graphics card, I'd definitely recommend choosing that, as the performance boost is just huge, and of course, it does remove a lot of the aliasing around trees and things like that. So unfortunately, this is locked away behind the paywall of owning an NVIDIA graphics card. Then, dynamic DLSS, if you have this option available, you can turn it on, and for the most part, your game will be stuck to the quality setting pretty much all the time until things start getting really taxing, and you're zooming into really populated, busy areas and things like that, in which case, your quality may be dropped from DLSS quality, for example, down to balanced, or even performance, where the game's resolution is dropped dramatically and the AI has to work a lot harder to keep a good resolution. For most people, this will be unnoticeable, and if you have the option to use dynamic DLSS or FSR or XeSS, it's probably worthwhile turning on unless you're specifically going for quality, in which case just leave it on quality and have anything dynamic turned off for stable, consistent performance pretty much through all different scenes. And with that, we've pretty much optimized the game's settings. We've kept some things to ultra, and of course, you should try and keep them there for a really good quality gameplay experience. Otherwise, if you're really clawing for FPS, you can definitely drop any setting in the game, and you should have a much better idea of what exactly has what impact thanks to this quick little optimization guide. There's not really anything else that we can control on the other tabs that should get us better performance. If you want even better performance yet, I'd highly recommend you check out my guides for optimizing Windows, which you'll find linked in the description down below. It covers Windows 10, 11, and of course things like NVIDIA Control Panel to get even better performance out of your system without having to invest in hardware. But of course, investing in a better PC is always going to give you the biggest performance boost. So, hopefully you found this video useful. If not interesting, thank you all for watching. My name's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao!